Hi there, my name is Joan Service and I am the Executive Director of the Arizona Housing Coalition, a professional association working to end homelessness by advocating for safe, affordable homes for all Arizonans. Welcome to webinar 1 of 4, looking at the advocacy process, how to raise your voice at the different institutions of power and how to talk to your legislators and policymakers and elected officials. Specifically, this webinar will be focused on the state legislative process. So let's just jump right in, shall we? What you see in front of you is actually the state capitol. So if you ever have the opportunity to visit, it is a beautiful facility and it's your facility. Your tax dollars go to pay for that. And it is a beautiful facility to visit. All right, let's jump right in. Okay, so in the Arizona legislature, there are 30 districts and they are all equal in population. They may not be equal in size, as you can see the district map in front of you, but they are equal in population. Arizona has 2 representatives and 1 senator for each of those 30 districts. So obviously, if you have 30 districts and 2 representatives, there are 60 members of the Arizona House of Representatives. In the Senate, you have 1 Senate for each of the 30 districts, so 30 members. Currently, our state legislative makeup is made up of 31 Republicans and 29 Democrats in the House of Representatives, and 16 Republicans and 14 Democrats in the Arizona State Senate. These numbers are important because there is an importance of the numbers 16, 31, and 1. And why is that important? Because when you work to get a bill to become a law, you need a simple majority in the House. So you need 16 representatives supporting your piece of legislation, and 16 members in the Senate supporting your piece of legislation, and 31 House members in the House of Representatives supporting your legislation, and then 1, and that's the governor, making sure that he or she does not veto your legislation and signs it into law. Legislators may run for election every 2 years, and each of those terms they're subject to an 8-year term limit. So the term limit in the House is 8 years. The term limit in the Senate is 8 years. They can only serve for consecutive of 8 years. However, once they have served that limit, they are then re-eligible for election after a 2-year respite. So 2 years from policymaking, and then they can come back. So we do have a lot of familiar faces at the state legislature, but we also have some new important voices as well. So let's continue. The legislative leadership. Each chamber has specific roles that are important in each of these chambers. In the House of Representatives, there's the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, the Majority Whip, the Speaker Pro Tem, the Minority Leader and occasionally an assistant leader, and then the Minority Whip. In the Senate, there's Senate President, Majority Leader, Majority Whip, President Pro Tem, Minority Leader, and sometimes an assistant leader, and Minority Whip. Members of the House elect a speaker to serve as that presiding officer of the body. That's the Speaker of the House. The Speaker is also the chief leadership position and controls the flow of legislation and committee assignments. The role of the Majority Leader has typically been defined by history and tradition. This officer is charged with scheduling legislation for floor consideration, planning the daily, weekly, and monthly legislative agenda, and consulting with the members to gauge party sentiment, and generally working to advance the goals of the majority party. Currently, in the state of Arizona, the majority party is Republican in the House and Senate. So the majority leader in both the House and Senate are trying to work to advance their caucus's agenda. The majority and minority whips are responsible for mobilizing votes within their parties. So as I just mentioned, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, we have the majority whips are both Republicans. The minority whips are Democrats. So the majority whip in the House and in the Senate are trying to connect with all of their members to make sure that they are all focused on the same party agenda and issues of concern for that party. Same thing with the minority whip. So in this case, it would be the Democratic caucus, the Democrats working together to make sure all of the other Democratic members are aligned with the caucus's ideas. And then the Speaker pro tem is usually the individual that presides over the House of Representatives, or the President pro tem when the Senate President or the Speaker of the House is called away to other activities. This is just a perfunctory role that that person plays to make sure that proceedings go on as normal. The legislative session, what a fun time it is. It usually, or actually it begins the second Monday in January, and it will go on for 100 days. Typically, it's supposed to go on for 100 days, but as we've seen more and more, it will continue on a little bit longer. The goal is to have, Arizona has what's called a part-time legislature. So they are only paid to be a legislator for 100 days. And then after that 100th day, they start losing some of their additional per diem costs or payments. The goal is to not only pass all the legislation through both chambers, the House and the Senate, and then once those bills are cleared, to also develop a state budget. And the goal is to obviously do that within 100 days. And then once the budget is approved, they adjourn sine die, which means without end. There is a situation where either the legislative leadership or the governor will call lawmakers back into what's called a special session to address issues that are most pressing. Most recently, there was a discussion about calling legislators back to the state capitol to take up issues as it related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ultimately, that didn't happen, and legislators quickly passed a budget and then adjourned sine die, and then waited till January of 2021 to come back. So that's special sessions have historically been kind of focused on topics of interest, most pressing topics. I think some historical special sessions have been around the alt fuel fiasco. Some childcare issues have also been need for a special session. So that's just an example of what typically happens at the legislative process. But again, typically legislators start the second Monday in January, and the goal is 100 days. I know that the legislators, especially those that are up for re-election, want to get out as soon as possible and get on the campaign trail. So typically it's 100 days, but it has gone even as long as June 30th, because obviously July 1st is the start of the state's fiscal year. So they need to have that budget approved before that deadline. Now, the legislative process, this is definitely something that you get to be a part of. Anybody can come up with an idea. Ideas for bills can come from many different places, from government organizations and agencies, from local governments, from municipalities, cities and towns and counties. It can come from the public. It can come from businesses. We see that quite often. It can come from interest groups. It can come from interest groups that you're a part of, like the Arizona Housing Coalition. We also advance ideas that we hope to become law through the legislative process. So again, we, working along with our members, research some best practices, some model legislation, and work with an identified legislator to have them introduce that piece of legislation. Legislators work with us, stakeholders, to discuss the ideas, to find consensus about what is the appropriate legislative fix. Then Legislative Council, which is a branch working alongside the Arizona House of Representatives and the Senate, they actually work on drafting legislation, making sure that the bill ideas that come out of our head are written in an appropriate fashion that take it into account statute and the current existing laws. So they draft the piece of legislation, and then legislators submit that legislation into the process once session starts. Again, usually in January. You can actually pre-file bills, typically around the November, December time period, but January is when you see a lot of legislation being introduced, dropped into the hopper, and Legislative Council has worked really diligently to draft those pieces of legislation. Now, I'll just walk through what the Housing Coalition does. Once we identify an idea, I work to identify a legislative champion that can champion the issue within their chamber. So most recently, we identified a piece of legislation and worked with a representative to introduce this piece of legislation. Because that individual is a House of Representatives, it was considered a House bill. And House bills start with a 2 number. So it would be House Bill 2157, for example. Wasn't that, but just as an example. Had we identified a Senate legislative champion, a senator, then that individual would introduce the legislation in his or her chamber, the Senate, and that piece of legislation would be Senate Bill 1 such and such. So in this example, could be Senate Bill 1122. Not the bill, but you get the idea. All right, next process. So this is all the different steps that a bill has to go through. Once that bill is dropped into, has been drafted by Legislative Council, it will be first and second read in that specific chamber. So let's just use the example of House Bill 2127. It would be first and second read in the House of Representatives. And then, as I mentioned, the Speaker of the House then decides where that bill, which committees that bill would be assigned to. So let's just say, for example, House Bill 2127, it was first and second read on the House and then assigned to House Health Committee. And then every piece of legislation also has to go to the Rules Committee. So House Bill 2127 is then scheduled to be heard in 2 committees, House Health and House Rules. If then it's up to the committee chairperson to place that bill on the agenda. So we have, when it comes to working with lawmakers, we have to not only identify a legislative champion, but we also have to talk to the chairpeople of the different committees. So in this example, we talked to the House Health chairperson and asked that they hear the bill 2127 and make sure that it's on the agenda and scheduled for a committee hearing. Now, the committee hearing is definitely an area that we want you to be a part of. Again, I talked about the House Health Committee chairperson. They set the agenda and they take public testimony. And this is where we want you to get involved. Now, we'll have another webinar talking about the request to speak system and the legislative website and how to maneuver and navigate that. But if you ever have the opportunity to testify in a committee, this is a picture of somebody testifying in a committee. And this is where the public has the opportunity to say why they are in support of or opposed to a piece of legislation. It's during that committee time where the other lawmakers that are sitting in the audience, or kind of a raised audience, they get to hear what the public thinks about this piece of legislation. It's also during that committee when amendments to legislation can be heard. So let's say we had a bill that we proposed, but maybe that we didn't take into account an important stakeholder. And so we would identify, or even our representative or even the chairperson of that committee would say, we need to offer an amendment to make sure that all stakeholder voices are heard. It would be during that committee hearing that that amendment is discussed and debated and voted on. And that amendment would either have a due pass. Actually, the amendment would have a due pass or a fail for the amendment. And then there's a secondary voting just even on that bill where there is a due pass, a hold, or a fail to pass on that piece of legislation. Again, we'll talk a little bit through a different webinar about how to navigate the request to speak system. So we talked about the first read, the second read, and committee hearing. Once the bill is passed out of the assigned committees, now remember, they also have to go through the rules committee to ensure that the proposed idea meets constitutional requirements. The bill is then heard in the party caucuses, so in the Democratic caucus or the Republican caucus. And no vote is held during that caucus discussion. It's just an opportunity for the other members of the caucus to understand what the bill is all about. Maybe they don't sit on the House Health Committee, but they still want to know what's going on around a piece of legislation. If a bill is amended in committee, it must go through the Committee of the Whole, or as we call it, COW. In COW, the whole chamber, so again, using HB 2127 as an example, in COW, the House of Representatives, all of the members, all 60 members, has the opportunity to discuss and adopt bill amendments. Substitute amendments from what was passed in committee can also be offered during the Committee of the Whole. If a bill is not amended in committee or has passed through the Committee of the Whole, it's then placed on a third read calendar. Third read is an opportunity for all members of the entire body to vote on the bill. Again, this is just a simple majority. That's what all the bill needs. In the House of Representatives, what does it need? 31 representatives to vote yes for that bill to continue on through the process, and 16 in the Senate. Once the bill passes out of the originating chamber on third read, it then goes over to the other chamber. So House Bill 2127 originated in the House, now it goes over to the Senate. And it goes through that whole process again, from first read, second read, committee hearings, caucus, Committee of the Whole, third read, and then transmission to the governor. Once that chamber has gone through that whole process, it's then, I'm trying to think of the process, then goes to, after it goes to third read, it depends on if there's any amendments about the next process. Let me talk about that. If there's any other, if House Bill 2127 has made its way to the Senate, and let's say that there's in Senate Health Committee, there's some amendments offered and passed, then obviously that's not the same bill that passed the House. So then there has to be another discussion between both chambers, and that's through the conference committee. So if the bill is amended in the second body, so again, House Bill 2127, if it was amended in the Senate, two things can happen. The bill sponsor can agree to the amendment and accept them as part of the bill. They can say, okay, we actually totally agree with what the Senate Health Committee did. That's totally fine. Then the originating body, the House, would final read the bill and agree to that new language. But if the sponsor didn't agree to those changes made in the second body, they can request a conference committee and try and figure out, that's when they all, with members of both of the chambers, get together and discuss the piece of legislation and try and find compromise on the final language. If successful, then that bill goes to final read in both bodies and then transmitted. Now, the final step of the legislative process is to go to the governor to sign, or in some cases veto that piece of legislation. If the bill passes through the second body unamended, it can go directly to the governor for review and possible signature. If the bill passes through the second body with an amendment, it goes to final read in both chambers before being sent to the governor for either signing into law, vetoing. The governor has the choice of not signing and yet allowing the legislation to become a law without its signature, or it can fail to pass. I've not seen that, so I can't even speak to that issue. But typically it's signing into law, veto, not signing into law, and allowing it to pass. A new thing that's actually it's not even new. It's just a legislative idea that has created kerfuffle in our field, and that's the Strike Everything Amendment. A Strike Everything Amendment proposes to delete the entire text of an existing bill and substitute new language essentially making it a completely different bill, possibly on an entirely different subject. So why does this happen? Because it circumvents the deadlines. There are legislative deadlines for introductions of bills in the different chambers. And obviously, because they're working on a short, abbreviated time frame of 100 days, they need to have those scheduled deadlines in place. A strike everything amendment circumvents that deadline and allows people, or allows ideas to be proposed even after these deadlines. So there are, most of the time when we talk about strike everything amendments, that's when ideas that sometimes are controversial and have failed in committee, they can come back to life through a strike everything amendment and go through a different committee that might have political leanings and legislative makeup that would be more favorable to that idea and allow that piece of legislation to pass. So typically strike everything amendments are controversial, but sometimes they're not. But typically they are, but sometimes they're not, just because in 100 days, a lot can happen in the state of the world. And so legislators will use a strike everything amendment to address that most pressing current issue that has arisen after the bill deadline for introduction of bills. So we talked about that it circumvents the deadlines. We talked about sometimes it addresses really pressing issues. And as I mentioned, it revives defeated bills. So when we think a bill is dead in committee, we never say it's truly, truly dead until the legislature has adjourned. And even then, there's the next legislative session. A lot of the ideas that, a lot of the bills that get introduced are repeats from previous legislation. So we as advocates always need to be paying attention to pieces of legislation as it goes through the process to make sure that it truly, truly is dead, or that we can revive it if we're in support of it. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the budget and appropriations. So, you know, a budget is a moral document. I'm a firm believer of that. The budget in the state of Arizona is how our lawmakers want to define his or her priorities and how the state should be using taxpayer money. In the beginning of session in January, the governor does what he or she has a state of the state address to lawmakers and to the general public and the community to set forth his or her agenda for this legislative process. Even though that governor is not a legislator, obviously the governor has the ability to influence policy. The governor also, around that same time, issues a budget template, a budget framework of how his or her priorities can be aligned with dollars and cents. Similarly, lawmakers have 100 days to define a budget. You know, obviously they're hearing legislation and going through that process, and a lot of the bills have a dollar figure attached to them. So as the bills make it through the House and through the Senate, those bills then get wrapped up into the legislative budget, and that has to obviously tries to get done within that 100-day time period, and definitely before the start of the state's fiscal year budget, which is July 1st. And then there's a reconciliation process between what the governor originally proposed back in January and to what lawmakers are now proposing. And it's through that budget negotiations where there's a lot of policy set. That's why I say that budgets are very much a moral document. So we as advocates need to be not only attentive to bills introduced, but we also need to be attentive to the budgeting process. And let me just say that that does create a bit of a wrinkle, because while our legislative process allows for folks to watch it online and through the Capitol TV, oftentimes budget negotiations are very much a last-minute conversation, and they happen oftentimes in the middle of the night. So as advocates, we need to be highly attentive, because this is part of how our taxpayer dollars are going. And as housing advocates, we want to make sure that that the budget includes addressing housing insecurity, and making sure that everybody has that safe, affordable place to call home. In our next webinar, we'll talk about how the coalition's priorities are really focused in on budgetary asks and how that they match, the policy idea matches the dollar amount and creates good policy. So we'll talk about that at our next webinar. But for now, I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about the legislative process. And I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you. Take care.